Hello, I'm Elise Vance, the author of the channel Borrowed Lives, and I offer you fascinating stories. Like and subscribe to my channel.
40 minutes after I gave birth to my son, my husband looked down at his tiny, wrinkled face in the bassinet and said, "We need to get a paternity test." At first, I honestly thought the exhaustion was making me hallucinate. The private room in the maternity ward still smelled heavily of chemical sanitizer and sweat. My entire body felt completely hollowed out. I was trembling uncontrollably from sheer fatigue while a monitor beeped rhythmically, measuring the steady drip of the 4 in the back of my hand. Outside the large window of the Seattle hospital, the city skyline was shrouded in a thick, gray downpour of freezing winter rain. And there was Marcus, standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed over his chest, looking like a project manager reviewing a flawed blueprint rather than a father looking at his newborn son. "The timeline just doesn't add up," he said, his voice flat. I stared at him, unable to process anger yet, just completely paralyzed by confusion. My brain felt heavy and slow after 22 grueling hours of labor. I remember blinking against the harsh fluorescent glare above, trying to make sense of the words while our son, Leo, made tiny, fragile coughing noises from the plastic bassinet. The attending nurse instantly stiffened. She didn't stop checking my vitals completely, but her movements slowed to a crawl. Cautious, like someone trying to walk across a frozen lake that was cracking beneath their feet. "Marcus," I whispered, my throat dry as sandpaper, "what on earth are you talking about?" He rubbed the back of his neck, refusing to look me in the eye. "You spent 4 days in Denver last spring for that architectural design seminar." I actually let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Not because it was funny, but because my mind was violently rejecting the reality of the situation. "You mean the professional development conference?" I asked. "You talked to me on FaceTime every single night I was there." "A phone call doesn't prove anything, Chloe." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked over at my mother-in-law, Evelyn, who was sitting near the window in a rigid vinyl armchair, clutching a cardboard cup of lukewarm coffee. She wasn't shocked. That was the very first thing I noticed. She didn't gasp, she didn't reprimand him. She looked utterly terrified. Her knuckles were stark white, pressing so hard against the paper cup that the plastic lid popped off and spilled onto the floor. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely audible, "this is entirely inappropriate right now." But he pressed on, completely unchecked. "I'm just saying, I'm not going to be naive. The conception window matches the trip perfectly." Conception window. He said it with the clinical detachment of an auditor inspecting financial fraud. I felt a profound, icy chill settle deep into my chest. Evelyn stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. "Marcus, stop it. Enough." But he ignored her completely, keeping his eyes locked on me. "I have a right to absolute certainty before I sign anything." That specific sentence broke the fog. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the staggering, breathtaking arrogance of it. He was standing there acting as if he were the victim in the room. Slowly, painfully, I reached for my smartphone resting on the bedside tray. My fingers were shaking so violently I nearly knocked over a cup of water. Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing. "Who are you calling at this hour?" I unlocked the screen, bypassing the photos of our vacations and our home, and scrolled down to the R's. "Chloe," Evelyn whispered, a note of pure panic rising in her throat as she stepped closer to the bed. "Please, don't do anything rash tonight. You're exhausted." I looked directly at her, my eyes cold. "It's fascinating," I said softly, "that nobody thought to give your son that exact same advice 5 minutes ago." Then, I pressed the call button. Rachel Vance answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was groggy but sharpened the second she heard me whisper. Rachel had been my anchor since our freshman year at corporate headquarters, a brilliant corporate litigation attorney who had transitioned into private family law after surviving 2 messy divorces of her own. She was fiercely independent and utterly unflappable. "Chloe? What's wrong? Did the baby arrive?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice from breaking completely. "Leo is here. But I need you to draft divorce papers, Rachel. As soon as humanly possible." The entire room fell into a suffocating silence. Marcus actually let out a short, scoffing laugh. "Oh, come on," he said, rolling his eyes. "You're being completely dramatic." That single word, dramatic, sliced deeper than the initial accusation. I had just endured nearly 22 hours of agonizing labor. I had an active foreline running into my arm, medical monitors taped to my skin, and every muscle in my lower body felt like it was tearing apart. Yet, somehow, I was the one acting out of turn. Rachel's tone shifted instantly from sleepy to lethal. "Chloe, tell me exactly what just happened." I kept my gaze locked entirely on Marcus. My husband demanded a paternity test 40 minutes after his son was born. In the delivery room, there was a dead pause on the line. Then, Rachel spoke with chilling calmness. "I'll be at the hospital by 10 tomorrow morning." Marcus crossed his arms and turned toward the dark window. "This is absolutely ridiculous. It's a standard medical question." Evelyn looked like she was about to collapse. She sank back into the vinyl chair, pressing her palms against her temples. "Chloe," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, just wait for the lab results before you start digging up the past." Digging. The word hung in the air like heavy smoke. She didn't say, "before you start making mistakes." She said digging. I noticed the attending nurse, a veteran named Sarah with kind eyes and graying hair, pause what she was doing. She adjusted Leo's swaddle, leaned over my bed under the pretense of checking my blood pressure, and whispered softly into my ear, "Pay very close attention to how someone treats you when you are completely helpless, sweetheart. It tells you everything you will ever need to know." Then, she gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze and quietly left the room. The winter rain continued to lash against the glass. Marcus stood with his back to me, casually scrolling through his phone as if we had just had a minor disagreement about dinner reservations. Evelyn kept her eyes glued to the linoleum floor. I sat upright in that sterile bed, holding my newborn son, realizing with terrifying certainty that I was married to a stranger. But worse than that, an awful intuition told me that his mother knew exactly why he was doing this. Around 3 in the morning, the staff wheeled me down the quiet, dimly lit corridor toward the postpartum recovery wing. The hospital was dead silent, save for the rhythmic bleeping of distant monitors and the soft scuff of rubber soles on the floor. Evelyn walked tightly beside the rolling bed, clutching her designer handbag against her chest like a shield. Right before the nurse pushed my bed through the double doors of the recovery room, Evelyn leaned down close to my face. Her breath smelled faintly of stale coffee, and her eyes were wide with a desperate, frantic energy. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "Please, for the sake of your own sanity, don't go looking for secrets you can't survive." She pulled back instantly, the regret washing over her face before she turned and hurried down the hall. As the doors swung shut, I completely stopped worrying about the paternity test. Because in that exact moment, I realized Evelyn wasn't terrified that I had been unfaithful. She was terrified of what I would uncover if I started looking into her son. For days after Leo was born, I brought him home to our house in Bellevue during the worst ice storm the Pacific Northwest had seen in a decade. The neighborhood looked completely drained of color, skeletal trees cased in thick ice, slick driveways, and dirty snow piled high against the curbs. Marcus carried the infant car seat inside without saying a word. He wasn't overtly hostile. He was just completely vacant. Like a logistics coordinator dropping off a package at a warehouse. I stood in our kitchen as the garage door groaned shut behind him. The ambient sounds of our normal life, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of the neighbor's snowblower felt completely alien. A slow cooker meal from our neighbor Julian sat on the counter wrapped in foil next to a mega pack of newborn diapers. Congratulations balloons from my colleagues at the design firm were still floating near the ceiling, yet my marriage felt entirely hollowed out. Around 6 that evening, Leo started crying frantically while I was struggling with nursing for what felt like the 100th time. No one prepares you for the sheer physical exhaustion of those first days. Your entire reality shrinks down to fluid ounces, sleep windows, and constant anxiety. As I sat in the nursery glider, completely worn raw, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "We should schedule the cheek swab for Friday," he said, adjusting his watch. I looked up slowly. I was running on less than 2 hours of sleep, wearing a stained, oversized sweatshirt, and he was standing there with total composure. You genuinely believe I betrayed you, Marcus? He sighed heavily, crossing his arms. I think we both need absolute clarity before we can move past this. The clarity is sitting right here in my arms. He gave a dismissive shrug. We'll let the lab determine that. Once the results are in, we can properly map out our next steps. Map out our next steps. He spoke as if I were a temporary project delay he was managing. Looking down at Leo sleeping against my chest, I felt a strange, profound shift inside me. It wasn't the agonizing heartbreak I had felt in the hospital anymore. It was distance. I was already emotionally packing my bags. That first week home was suffocating. Marcus moved his things to the home office, claiming Leo's waking hours would disrupt his corporate schedule, but the true separation was social. Even without making a public accusation, Marcus managed to poison the water around us. My phone began buzzing with incredibly coded text messages from his side of the family and mutual acquaintances. Thinking of you both during this season of testing. Marriage requires immense grace and forgiveness. Praying for truth and restoration. Nobody asked a direct question because they didn't need to. Marcus had already carefully dropped the narrative into the ears of anyone who would listen. One afternoon, while Leo was sleeping in his bassinet, I went downstairs to grab a glass of water and froze. Marcus was in the kitchen, talking in a low, hushed voice on his phone. I'm just protecting my assets, he told whoever was on the other end. Men get trapped into providing for someone else's life all the time. The word trapped burned through me. 2 miscarriages, 3 grueling rounds of IVF, thousands of dollars in shared debt, and years of mutual grief, and now I was the one trapping him. Evelyn came over almost daily, always bearing gifts, organic baby blankets, high-end strollers, clothes from boutique shops. She moved through the house like a nervous ghost, obsessively cleaning things that were already spotless. One afternoon, she spent 45 minutes meticulously reorganizing my baking pantry. Sweetheart, she said, her back to me as she wiped down a pristine shelf. Men panic when a baby arrives. The pressure of fatherhood changes them. I stared at her back. Does it usually make them accuse their wives of infidelity 40 minutes into postpartum? She flinched visibly, her shoulders dropping. She didn't defend Marcus this time. Instead, she started rambling about family legacies, the importance of keeping up appearances, and the necessity of looking forward, not backward. It was obvious she was desperately trying to patch up a crumbling dam with paper towels. By the second week, the sleep deprivation caught up to me completely. I hadn't washed my hair in days, my body still throbbed with physical pain, and the house smelled permanently of baby formula and cold coffee. That evening, Marcus came home carrying a bouquet of cheap tulips from the grocery store. I thought we could try to have a normal evening, he said, setting them down. Just 3 hours earlier, he had emailed me a legal waiver for the DNA collection agency. Now, he was offering discount flowers as if we were resolving a petty argument about who forgot to take out the recycling. He sat on the sofa beside me while the financial news played silently on the TV. You know, he said, attempting a gentle tone. If the results come back clean, we can just put this unfortunate chapter behind us. I turned my head slowly toward him. If... He pinched the bridge of his nose. Chloe, don't start parsing my words. No, I whispered. You've parsed enough for both of us. He stood up instantly, his face darkening with irritation. This is exactly what I mean. Everything has to be an emotional production with you lately. There it was again. The gaslighting. The subtle vocabulary meant to make a woman doubt her own sanity. I stood up too quickly to lay Leo in his crib, my vision swimming from exhaustion. In my haste, a bottle attached to my breast pump tipped over, spilling breast milk directly across Marcus's open MacBook on the coffee table. Are you serious? He snapped, lunging forward. He grabbed the laptop instantly, wiping it down frantically with his sleeve. He didn't check on me. He didn't look at the baby who had startled awake. His only priority was the machine. Do you have any idea how much company data is on here? I looked at my crying son, then at my husband panicking over aluminum and circuits. And in that quiet kitchen, the last remaining piece of my devotion to him died permanently. Later that evening, Evelyn arrived unexpectedly under the pretense of bringing a box of hand-me-down clothes from her church network. I was too emotionally hollowed out to argue. Leo had finally drifted off around midnight, so I sat on the living room rug, listlessly sorting tiny cotton onesies while Evelyn folded blankets nearby in tense silence. That's when the card fell out. It was tucked deep inside the sleeve of a hand-knit blue cardigan. The envelope was faded, its corners bent and yellowed with age. Written across the front in Evelyn's distinct, elegant cursive was, "Happy 12th birthday, Julian. Love always, Grandma Evie." I froze. The ambient sounds of the house seemed to vanish entirely. Evelyn noticed the card in my hand and moved with a sudden, panic speed I hadn't seen from her in years. "Oh, give me that," she said quickly, snatching it from my fingers. "That's just junk mail that got mixed up in the donation box." I stared directly up at her. "Evelyn, who is Julian?" Her expression fractured instantly, a mask of sheer panic slipping over her features before she forced a tight smile. "Just a boy from my old neighborhood group." I said nothing. People do not sign birthday cards to random neighborhood children as Grandma Evie. Evelyn stuffed the card deep into her coat pocket, her hands trembling. "You're completely sleep-deprived, Chloe. You're overthinking things that don't exist. You need rest." She left the house less than 2 minutes later. At 3:45 a.m., as I sat in the dim nursery rocking Leo under the faint glow of the floor lamp, the house creaking against the freezing Seattle wind, I opened my phone and pulled up social media. Evelyn's public profile was exactly what you'd expect: charity galas, garden club updates, and curated family photos. But I began digging deeper, scrolling back through years of comments on her older posts. Finally, I found it. A comment from 4 years ago left by a woman named Natalie Vance based in Portland. "Julian still asks why his dad never comes to his weekend games. Please ask Marcus to at least call him on his birthday, Evelyn. It's getting impossible to make excuses for him." I stared at the glowing screen until my eyes burned and the phone dimmed. Then I looked down at my son sleeping peacefully against my collarbone. For the first time since the hospital room, the pending paternity test ceased to matter entirely. Because in that quiet room, the horrifying truth clicked into place. Evelyn wasn't terrified that I had cheated on her son. She was terrified that I would finally uncover the monumental secret her son had been hiding from me for our entire marriage. I didn't confront Marcus the next morning. A younger, more impulsive version of myself would have marched into the kitchen, slammed the screenshots onto the counter, and demanded immediate answers. But exhaustion alters your perspective. Motherhood sharpens it. By the 3rd week of Leo's life, I was operating in strict, calculated intervals. Feed, change, wash, survive. Meanwhile, Marcus began acting completely normal again, which was arguably more terrifying. He kissed Leo's forehead before leaving for his architectural firm, emptied the trash without being asked, and watched television in the evenings as if we were just a standard suburban couple navigating a temporary rough patch. Then, every few days, he would casually drop a reminder about the Friday lab appointment into the conversation. Like a behavioral leash. I finally called Rachel late one night from the laundry room floor, the only place where the hum of the dryer could drown out my voice. "I found something," I whispered into the receiver. Rachel listened in absolute, unbroken silence as I detailed the birthday card, the hidden comment from Portland, and Evelyn's erratic behavior. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Do you want legal reassurance, Chloe, or do you want the brutal truth?" Rachel asked, her voice shifting into her sharp, courtroom register. "I want to know if my last 7 years were a total lie." Rachel exhaled slowly. "Then do not confront him yet." Not a word. It was an incredibly difficult pill to swallow. Every instinct screamed at me to demand the truth. But Rachel explained a vital piece of human psychology. People who successfully manage massive, multi-year lies do not suddenly become honest when cornered. They simply panic, destroy evidence, and get smarter. So I waited. I stopped reacting and I started observing. Really observing. The kind of hypervigilance that only takes over once safety completely evaporates. I noticed how Marcus suddenly stepped out into the freezing backyard to take specific calls. I noticed he had changed his phone passcode and now placed the device face down on every surface. I noticed that Evelyn had completely stopped visiting our house. A few days later, Marcus left his wool coat draped over a kitchen chair while he showered upstairs. His phone vibrated violently inside the breast pocket. I stood over it for a full 60 seconds, hating myself for what I was about to do. But then Leo let out a soft cry from his swing, and the reality of protecting my child pushed me over the edge. I pulled the phone from the pocket. The lock screen was lit up with a preview of a text message. Natalie, Julian's tournament starts at 6 o'clock on Friday. He keeps asking if you're actually going to show up this time. My stomach completely bottomed out. There it was. No misunderstanding. No innocent explanation. Just the cold, ugly truth. I slid the phone back into his pocket exactly as I had found it, just seconds before the sound of the shower cut off upstairs. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the house like a ghost executing a script. Marcus grilled dinner while the rain beat against the siding. At one point, he looked into the bassinet, smiled warmly, and said, "He's really starting to develop my jawline, don't you think?" I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper to keep from screaming. 2 days later, Rachel drove up from her office to meet me at a quiet espresso bar tucked away inside a commercial complex near Renton. I brought Leo strapped securely to my chest in a wrap. Rachel brought a legal pad and an expression of grim determination. She listened intently as I recounted the exact text message from the phone screen. When I finished, she didn't offer empty sympathy. Instead, she looked me dead in the eye and asked, "How much liquid capital do you have independent access to right now?" I blinked, momentarily thrown off. "That's your primary concern?" "That is my immediate concern," Rachel countered, leaning forward. "Betrayal becomes a matter of strict logistics the second the legal system gets involved. If Marcus has been maintaining a hidden life 3 hours south of here for over a decade, there is a very high probability that marital assets have been quietly funneled away to sustain it." She was entirely right. Within a week of Rachel quietly auditing our linked accounts, we discovered a deficit of nearly $22,000 missing from what was supposed to be our long-term home renovation savings. Marcus had categorized the withdrawals over the last 2 years as private equity investments. Rachel called it legal concealment. I called it a calculated betrayal. When Rachel first suggested hiring a private investigator, it sounded completely absurd, like a plot point from a cheap television drama. But the reality of it was profoundly unglamorous. The investigator was a quiet, middle-aged former detective named Vance who met me inside a nondescript diner off Interstate 5. He charged a steep hourly retainer. To afford his upfront fee, I had to sell a vintage platinum watch that had belonged to my maternal grandfather, the man who had stepped in to help raise me. Selling it felt like tearing away a piece of my own skin. I sat in my car in the rain outside the estate jewelry buyer afterward, sobbing quietly while Leo slept soundly in the back seat. I wasn't crying for the loss of the asset. I was crying because my life had disintegrated to the point where I was trading family heirlooms to discover who my husband actually was. Vance worked with lethal efficiency. Within 10 days, he presented me with a thick digital file that left no room for ambiguity. Marcus's routine business trips to the Oregon branch were an elaborate fiction. The professional seminar in Denver had been real, but his itinerary had included an unlisted domestic partner. Natalie Vance existed. Julian existed. Vance documented a paper trail of apartment rental co-signatures, consistent cash transfers, a secondary cellular contract under a business alias, and regular holiday packages shipped from Evelyn's address directly to Portland. When I opened the encrypted file at a coffee shop in Bellevue, a wave of intense physical nausea hit me. I wasn't even shocked anymore. I was just profoundly, exhaustively tired. That same afternoon, Leo had an absolute meltdown inside a crowded grocery store while I was trying to buy formula. The kind of raw, piercing infant scream that makes every single person in the aisle stop and judge. I stood there by the pharmacy counter, rocking him awkwardly while tears rolled down my own face. A woman passing by stopped and offered a gentle, sympathetic look. "Hard day?" she asked softly. I let out a breath that was half a laugh and half a sob. "Lady, you have absolutely no idea." By that point, sleep was a myth. My body was still recovering from childbirth, My reality was fracturing, and every new piece of information felt heavier than the last. There was one specific evening that nearly broke my resolve entirely. I was sitting in our dark driveway after a doctor's appointment, staring at the dashboard with Vance's files open on my phone. The proof was undeniable. And yet, a desperate, irrational part of me wanted to walk through the front door, hand the phone to Marcus, and beg him to lie to me in a way that made it all make sense again. Not because I trusted him, but because I deeply missed the illusion of safety I had lived in for 7 years. I called Rachel, my voice cracking so hard I could barely articulate the words. "I don't even know what I'm mourning anymore," I confessed. Rachel was silent for a long moment before she delivered a line that permanently altered my perspective. "Chloe, grieving the man you thought he was is entirely different from needing the man he actually is." Week later, I finally reached out to Natalie. I had prepared myself for a wall of defensive anger, but instead, I was met with a deep, echoing exhaustion. We agreed to meet at a generic roadside diner halfway between Seattle and Portland, a place with faded vinyl booths and a constant hum of highway traffic. Natalie looked older than her digital footprint suggested. Not aged, just weathered by years of carrying a heavy secret alone. Julian wasn't with her. We both agreed a 14-year-old boy shouldn't have a front-row seat to the wreckage of his father's life. Natalie wrapped her hands around a mug of black coffee as I recounted the scene in the hospital delivery room. When I told her that Marcus had demanded a paternity test 40 minutes after Leo's birth, she stared at me in absolute stupefaction. Then a sharp, bitter laugh escaped her lips. "He accused me of the exact same thing when Julian was a toddler," she said, her voice dropping. I blinked, stunned. "What?" Whenever he was pulling away or handling things he felt guilty about, he suddenly became convinced I was hiding something. It was like clockwork. The realization hit me with the weight of an anchor. Projection. That was the clinical term Rachel used later. Marcus projected his own capacity for betrayal onto the women in his life because he couldn't bear the weight of his own duplicity. Natalie laid out the timeline with devastating clarity. She had met Marcus 14 years ago during a corporate design consultation in Oregon. Julian was born a year later. Marcus then married me 7 years ago, having convinced Natalie that our relationship was merely a platonic business partnership that he couldn't legally dissolve yet due to shared assets. And Evelyn had managed the entire fraud, tracking birthdays, routing financial support, and maintaining the silence. At one point, Natalie looked at me with genuine pity. "He told me you were emotionally unstable, Chloe." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "He told me you didn't exist, and then he told me I was unfaithful." For the first time all afternoon, a faint, tight smile appeared on Natalie's face. It wasn't born of amusement, but of the grim solidarity of two women who had finally mapped the exact same maze. Marcus had constructed two entirely separate realities, built on the foundations of our trust. When I walked out to my car afterward, a light flurry of sleet was beginning to fall across the asphalt. Leo was sleeping peacefully in his car seat, completely oblivious to the storm. Sitting on my passenger seat was my phone, glowing with a new notification. The lab email had arrived. I opened the document with completely steady hands. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. Marcus was Leo's father. I had always known it, but seeing the numbers only magnified the sheer, calculated cruelty of his actions. He had intentionally humiliated me in a hospital bed simply because he couldn't live with the reflection in his own mirror. The 4th of July weekend rolled around, bringing with it the oppressive, stagnant heat of a Pacific Northwest summer. The air was thick, mosquitoes buzzed around the porch lights, and lawnmowers roared to life before 8 a.m. Despite the internal collapse of my life, the world insisted on remaining aggressively normal. Neighbors argued over landscape bark, kids rode scooters down the cul-de-sac, and the local news ran endless segments on fireworks safety. Evelyn insisted on hosting her traditional holiday garden party anyway. She called me multiple times the week prior, her voice strained through a filter of desperate normalcy. "Chloe, families need these traditions to find a path toward healing," she urged. Healing. She used the word with the clinical detachment of a corporate PR firm. I agreed to go. Not to appease her, and certainly not for Marcus, but because Rachel's advice had taken root. If you let him control the narrative, he will rewrite the history of your entire marriage before the ink on the filing is dry. Marcus had already started the spin cycle. According to the whispers filtering back to me, I was suffering from severe postpartum paranoia. Poor Marcus was simply navigating a difficult family transition with patience. It is truly remarkable how men like him can rebrand systemic cruelty as noble endurance the moment an audience is watching. The garden party commenced at 4 in the afternoon. Evelyn's backyard looked identical to every July 4th I had spent there over the last 7 years. Crimson and blue linen runners spanned the long folding tables, artisanal potato salad sat sweating under the intense heat, and a classic rock playlist droned softly from an outdoor sound system near the cedar deck. Extended family and partners drifted through the side arbor, carrying coolers of craft beer and wrapped platters. From the outside, it was the perfect picture of an affluent suburban holiday. It was staggering how easily absolute deception could blend into the background of a summer afternoon. Leo was nearly 5 months old by then, resting heavily against my shoulder as relatives crowded around, offering the usual shallow platters of praise. He has Marcus's structure. What an absolute angel. I smiled mechanically, feeling entirely like an undercover operative walking through a carefully staged theater production. Marcus moved through the crowd with total confidence. That specific ease infuriated me far more than any direct confrontation could have. He looked relaxed, completely assured that he had managed the crisis and controlled the damage. At one point, I watched him laughing by the brick barbecue pit, holding Leo while talking to his cousin. For a fleeting second, I saw the ghost of the man I thought I had married, the man who had danced with me in our first tiny apartment, the man who had held me while I wept after our second miscarriage and promised we would endure. The memory cut deeply, forcing me to step back toward the shade of the patio. Grief is a labyrinth when the person who broke your life is also the person who built your happiest memories. Natalie arrived at precisely 6:30. There was no theatrical entrance, no screaming tires. A silver sedan simply pulled up quietly against the curb outside the property line. She walked up the driveway alone. We had both agreed Julian would remain in the air-conditioned car unless it became absolutely necessary. Natalie wore simple dark denim and a structured linen shirt, unassuming, grounded, completely real. She looked anxious, and honestly, so did I. Evelyn caught sight of her through the kitchen window and nearly dropped a crystal pitcher of lemonade. That was the exact second the illusion shattered for her. She finally realized this wasn't something she could sweep under the rug. Marcus hadn't noticed Natalie yet. He was far too busy occupying the center of the room. Around 7:30, after the dinner plates had been cleared, Marcus stood up near the edge of the deck, holding a premium microbrew. He picked up a salad fork and tapped it sharply against the glass. Clink, clink, clink. That sharp, metallic noise still echoes in my ears. The chatter in the yard died down. Evelyn looked violently ill, standing rigid near the patio steps. Marcus offered the family a tight, triumphant smile. "Hey, everyone, if I could just have a quick minute. I think it's time to finally clear up some of the recent tension." I shifted Leo slightly against my chest, the humid air clinging to my skin. Far off across the city, the first commercial fireworks were beginning to thud against the sky. "The official lab results came back this week," Marcus announced, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. Marcus's smile widened. "Leo is 100% my son." A smattering of polite, incredibly relieved applause broke out among the older aunts and uncles. And then, Marcus made the catastrophic mistake of his life. He looked directly at me, raising his glass. And, because I firmly believe that strong families are built on grace and moving forward, I am completely willing to forgive Chloe for the immense stress and paranoia this situation put our family through over the last few months. The entire backyard went dead silent. I actually felt my pulse slow down to a steady, freezing calm. Every single shred of residual doubt evaporated. The man genuinely believed his own fiction. He thought he was the hero of the story. I stepped up from the shade, adjusting Leo firmly in my arms. "Marcus," I said, my voice completely clear and level. "I am incredibly glad you brought up the concept of truth." His manufactured smile faltered slightly. "Chloe, let's not do this now," he warned under his breath, stepping closer. "Because before anyone here talks about Grace," I continued, ignoring him entirely as I walked toward the covered patio, "everyone in this yard deserves to know exactly what kind of foundation this family was built on." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice a sharp, terrified hiss. "Chloe, please." Marcus let out a dismissive, patronizing chuckle, looking around the yard for backup. "Don't humiliate yourself, Chloe. You're still recovering." I looked him dead in the eye, the weight of the last 5 months anchoring me to the earth. "You demanded a paternity test while I was still bleeding in a hospital bed to cover your own tracks. You don't get to dictate what is comfortable anymore." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the teenagers near the lawn chairs froze. I reached into my bag and pulled out my tablet. Rachel had helped me configure the network settings perfectly the night before. No dramatics, no shouting match. Just pure, unassailable documentation. With 2 taps, I mirrored the tablet screen directly onto the large outdoor television Evelyn used for summer movie nights. The first document appeared instantly, Leo's official DNA report showing 99.9999% probability. Marcus rolled his eyes aggressively. "We literally just established that, Chloe. This is exactly the instability I was." "Yes," I interrupted softly. "Now, let's review the files you conveniently omitted from the presentation." I swiped to the next slide. The screen filled with years of bank statements highlights, co-signed lease agreements for a property in Portland, travel itineraries matching his regional corporate audits, and dozens of photos Vance had taken of Marcus entering a secondary residence 3 hours south. The silence that blanketed the backyard became heavy enough to choke on. Marcus's cousin slowly lowered his bottle to the table. An old family friend let out an audible gasp, covering her mouth. Marcus lunged toward the patio console, his face twisting into rage. "You illegally accessed my private professional data?" I almost laughed out loud. Privacy. That was his immediate defense. Not the decades of deception, not the shattered lives. His proprietary data. Natalie stepped out from the side gate, walking calmly into the center of the lawn. Marcus froze mid-stride the moment his eyes landed on her. For the first time in 7 years, I saw absolute, unadulterated terror take hold of his features. Natalie looked at him, her expression completely vacant of affection. "You told me your marriage was a legal formality that had ended before it even started, Marcus." The yard remained completely motionless. Evelyn sank heavily into a nearby wicker chair, her face buried in her hands, weeping silently. Marcus scrambled, his voice rising an octave as he looked at his surrounding relatives. "This is a total setup. Natalie is an old associate from the Oregon branch. This is being completely warped by a bidder." "An associate," Natalie cut in, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel, "whose son calls you dad and just turned 14 last month." That single sentence completely broke his defensive line. You could physically feel the alliance shift across the grass. Marcus looked around frantically, but every single face had turned away from him. "Evie," Marcus's uncle asked, his voice dark and demanding. "Did you know about this?" Evelyn couldn't even look up. "I was just trying to protect the family name," she sobbed into her hands. I looked at her, then back at Marcus. "No," I said quietly. "You were helping him manage a double life at our expense." Marcus pointed a shaking finger at me, his face flushed dark crimson. "You are destroying this family. You're completely ruining everything." I shook my head slowly, feeling lighter than I had in a year. "No, Marcus. I just stopped carrying the weight of your secrets." I reached into my portfolio, pulled out the finalized, stamped divorce petition, and set it firmly on the table next to his drink. Rachel had insisted on physical copies. "Sometimes reality needs physical mass," she had told me. Marcus stared down at the documents, completely paralyzed. Above the tree line, the first major community fireworks exploded, filling the sky with brief, brilliant flashes of silver and gold that reflected off the dark television screen. Nobody looked at the sky. Nobody felt like celebrating. The agonizing discomfort finally belonged entirely to him. As I walked down the driveway toward my car with Leo wrapped safely against me, Marcus's voice echoed down the pavement. "You are going to regret this, Chloe. You'll be entirely alone." I stopped at the driver's side door, turning back to look at the man who had spent months attempting to break my grip on reality. "The only thing I regret, Marcus, is not realizing sooner that your accusation in that hospital room was actually your confession." I buckled my son into his car seat, the humid evening air settling around us as I started the engine and drove away from the house in Bellevue. 6 months later, Leo and I were settled into a modest, two-bedroom townhouse in Miamisburg. The walls were slightly thin, the carpet was standard beige, and the kitchen was so narrow that I couldn't open the dishwasher and the oven door at the same time. At first, I hated it. It felt like a physical manifestation of failure. At nearly 40, I thought I had secure, permanent roots. Instead, I was assembling flat-pack furniture while my son napped in a room that smelled like fresh paint. The first evening we moved in, I sat on the hardwood floor eating takeout out of a container while Leo slept in a borrowed crib. Outside, the rain beat rhythmically against the glass, and I cried harder than the day I walked out of the garden party. Because walking away isn't the true test. Rebuilding the days that follow is. Divorce reduces life to raw math, custody percentages, legal fees, shifting insurance policies, and utility deposits. You lose your identity for a while and become a collection of case files. Marcus fought viciously through the mediation process, not to reclaim the relationship, but to salvage the pristine image he had projected to his professional circle. He posted heavily curated photos of his brief weekend visitations online, joined a local community board, and told mutual contacts he was navigating a tragedy with dignity. It's fascinating how men discover a passion for public virtue once their private character has been liquidated. The true challenge, however, wasn't financial or logistical. It was the crushing quiet of the evenings. Being a single mother at 39 introduces a very distinct type of isolation. Most peers have already stabilized their routines. Their children are independent, their paths set. I found myself sitting alone in pediatric waiting rooms, balancing a diaper bag, trying desperately to look like a woman who wasn't terrified of the future. Therapy eventually provided a compass. My practitioner's office was quiet, filled with the scent of chamomile and rows of heavy texts. One Tuesday afternoon, I finally vocalized the core of my resentment. I exposed the entire lie I said, staring at the floor. "But it still feels like I lost the match." She looked at me gently. Because healing from trauma and winning a conflict are two entirely different destinations. The realization stuck. Recovery isn't a cinematic triumph. Sometimes survival is just washing the dishes before sunset and keeping your child safe. Evelyn began sending handwritten letters late in the fall. The initial correspondence was filled with structural excuses. I was trying to prevent a total collapse. Marcus has hidden psychological struggles. I left them unread in a drawer for months. Then, in November, a brief note arrived with no justifications. Just 7 words. "I should have given you the truth." That was the sole honest gesture she ever offered. Eventually, I permitted supervised visits between her and Leo. Not because she had earned absolution, but because my son deserved a relationship with his extended history, provided that history was willing to behave with absolute transparency going forward. Natalie called me out of the blue shortly before the winter holidays. We met for lunch at a generic diner off the interstate halfway between our homes. She looked noticeably lighter, the structural tension gone from her jaw. Julian had just started his freshman year, developed a passion for track, and was currently struggling through remedial geometry. He sounded like a normal, developing teenager rather than an unlisted asset in a legal dispute. Natalie stirred her tea, looking out the window. "For nearly a decade, Chloe, I was led to believe you were the barrier to his happiness." I nodded, watching the steam rise from my cup. "And he convinced me you were an impossibility." She gave a small, weary smile. "It turns out we were just protecting the exact same phantom. We didn't leave the diner as best friends. Life doesn't resolve itself into neat Hollywood endings." But we left as two individuals who no longer viewed each other through the lens of a liar's design. That was more than enough. By the time the final divorce decree was signed in January, there were no dramatic speeches or grand pronouncements. Just ink on standard legal bond paper, allocation numbers, and the profound quiet that follows a controlled burn. One evening, as the snow began to fall softly over the townhouses, I stood by the window watching the streetlights illuminate the courtyard while Leo slept peacefully upstairs. The entire neighborhood was completely still. And for the first time in an entire year, I realized I wasn't bracing for the next blow. That absolute peace was worth every single loss along the way. People often look at stories of betrayal and assume the goal is destruction. It isn't. Real resolution is refusing to let the person who broke your reality dictate how you rebuild it. It's constructing a functional, honest life even when the process feels entirely unglamorous. It's discovering that standing alone in an empty kitchen is infinitely safer than sharing a mansion built on quicksand. Reclaiming your life late in the game isn't a failure. It is often the very first authentic choice you've ever been allowed to make.